Check, check. This is still on and ready to go. So let me get back there just to turn the video on to you.
Sure.
And then I'm gonna have...
This is for you. Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Hi, good afternoon. We're all in our food coma already. This is going to be a long workshop. I am so glad for you to be here. If you are here for elder training, you are not in the right place. If you're here for deacon training, you're not in the right place. You're in the conversation that'll continue what I talked about this morning. This will be mostly a chance for us to talk with each other and not to hear more from me. Although I want to start with any questions or comments or thoughts you've had since I finished this morning. I had a couple of people after the presentation ask me some good questions, and I thought if they had good questions, I bet some of you have good questions too. But I know there are people here that are watching online, and we're glad for you to be here too, and those that will be watching later. As you're coming in, if you can make sure to sit far enough up that you can be in a group, that'll be great. I'm going to open up our time together in prayer. Gracious God, thank you for what you are teaching us today, for the relationships we're making today, for the ways you're shaping us more and more into your church. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Is there anybody here that was not here this morning? All right, welcome. So this is going to be, what's your name? Paige, thank you so much for coming. Who wants to tell Paige something about what I talked about this morning? Just anything about what I talked about this morning.
Huddle is different from the game.
The huddle is Gail, that I sat next to at lunch. She said the huddle is different from the game. I used a football analogy about how huddles are important, but nobody wins a game if you don't go out of the huddle. And that churches, what's the church version of a huddle? What are some things that are kind of huddles for a church? Excuse me? Session meetings are a great example of a huddle. Pi is a great example. Bible study, worship, where we're primarily with each other. And then what's the game? Outreach, where we're caring for people in the community, right? So who will tell Paige something else you remember from this morning? Anybody remember the scripture that I looked at? John 20, yeah, was it 20? Yeah, 20. And what was the story about? Yeah, Jesus coming to the disciples in their huddle after the evening of the first Easter. And he said, as the Father has sent me, so I send you. And that Jesus' mission from God is the same mission that we have to serve others around us. Anything else that Paige absolutely has to know? Yes, thank you. You were the one that listened when I said you could fall asleep the whole rest of the day. What's your name? Priscilla? Priscilla, you're the one that got it. So all of these things mean that the primary beneficiaries that the church exists should be people outside of the church and not inside of the church, right? All right, thank you. So Paige, we're so glad you're here. Yes. So I'll tell you one of the questions that somebody asked me afterwards that might be a good question for you too. She said, how do you actually start to make these changes in a church? She said, she wanted to know how Paula, so there was a video that I showed of, I think she was very inspiring, this woman that's at a really small church of 40 people who they use their third Sunday as a way to reach out to their community rather than worship. And so she was talking about visiting middle school cross-country meets and feeding the road workers outside of their church and making care baskets for the EMTs. And she didn't say this, but when the post office had COVID go through it the second time, they made all of those employees care baskets then. That was, of course, a long time ago. So somebody asked me, well, how did Paula actually get her church to do these things? And I don't know if that question rings true to any of you. But I'll tell you what I told her, and some of you might have an example too of how something that you've done in your church. But what I thought of was that it is easier to convince people to try and experiment than it is to say, well, now we're going to start doing this thing all the time, but hey, why don't we try this one Sunday? Just try doing this one Sunday and see what it feels like, rather than, okay, we're going to do this the third Sunday of every month, the way that Paula's church is doing it. She also, the woman I was talking to, she came up with a good idea too. She said, well, we could also, have a hymn sing or something in the sanctuary, and then another room where people were putting together care baskets or something, and let people choose so they didn't have to feel like they weren't getting what they wanted. So those were some examples of the things that she and I talked about. I wonder if any of you have any examples of what a way to maybe start making a shift in your congregations towards being more outwardly focused.
Our neighborhood gave us certain ideas that they wanted us to do.
Oh, right. So did you actually meet? So I'm going to give you, this is definitely worth everybody hearing. What's your name?
My name's Tom.
Tom talked about the neighborhood giving them ideas. So tell us what happened.
Our neighborhood where our church is in the hilltop of Columbus. It's one of the lower income areas of Columbus right now. Has a lot of systemic problems. And so our neighborhood lets us know what we should be doing.
And how do they let you know?
Oh, very demonstratively let us know what we should be doing.
So how do you, because
Well,
I know a lot of churches don't
They
don't
tell
know.
us we see the needs of the neighborhood and how they're not being met. And so we're trying to do outward worship and outreach in those areas that can help our neighborhood thrive and help our neighborhood heal.
Right.
Is that from the city council?
Beg your pardon?
The city council?
We're not on city council, no ma'am.
No, I mean the people who let you know the need.
No, they're neighbors.
So
They're the homeless. They're the hungry. They're the people that come to our open meal every week. They're the people that come looking for blankets, looking for sleeping bags, looking for tents.
So when they ask you, you listen.
Just bare necessities.
Yeah. So when they ask you for stuff, you listen.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else want to answer how you would answer that question from the lady? Yeah. Thank you. You know what? I slept in instead of exercising this morning, and so I'm going to run the mic so that I can get my steps and exercise.
So we run a food pantry, and we have a monthly meal, free meal. And someone suggested at session that we needed to, the people that come to the free meal come every month. I mean, it's the same people now that come. And we needed to change the way we do it so that we don't have the dichotomy of the served and the servers. And we need to mix that up a little bit and ask them if they want to help us set the table, whatever. You know.
Yeah,
So
that's great.
It's a small thing, but
Yeah, and how? And so somebody just had that idea in a session
we haven't
meeting,
done it
and
yet,
yeah, great. Hi, Priscilla. Priscilla, the star student.
Not the star student. I will say that we have had several things bubble up because of a member coming across a need and wanting to do something about that, coming up with an idea, and we're just like, yep, run with that. Go for it.
Yeah, so there's something, right, too, about having the idea not come from the pastor. You know, it's funny, sometimes when pastors suggest things, there's resistance, you know, and often when it comes out from the flow.
You're still looking for volunteers?
Yeah, sure.
All right. We do a program where we pack food into backpacks for kids who receive subsidized meals at school who don't have access to food necessarily on weekends and holidays. And been doing that for a while, and we've actually got the church across the street from us is now wanting to do the same things. We're helping them get off the ground with that as well.
That's great. Thank you, Carl. What other, before we're going to have a chance to hear from each other about good ideas about getting out into the community, but I wonder if you have any other thoughts or perspectives on the presentation this morning before we move into that. That's what we're going to do next, is talk about some ideas that you have. But I wondered if you had any other thoughts or questions or perspectives on the time we had this morning together.
No, I was struck by the comment of, would our community miss us if we were gone? And that's a real touchy question. You know,
Yeah.
I would miss our church if it was gone.
Right,
but would
right.
But would
Right.
my community miss
Right.
us if we were gone?
Right. Yeah, and I try to, I think so too. I think it's very convicting, right? And then, and it's also easy to think, well, I have people that love me that would miss me if I was part of the church that died, that was gone. But would they miss what you do corporately, to make a difference? When I was serving a church in Central Illinois, we would just ask ourselves, we were kind of a church that drew from people not from our neighborhood and from all around, and we just say, well, would people in the neighborhood care at all if our church went away? And that helped us. Like, we started offering a free lunch program in the summer. The city used us as a site for a free lunch program. And so we started thinking kind of critically. We painted a person's house. We tried to think specifically, because it's very easy to get stuck in the huddle thinking, well, we care for all these people that are within the church. And we want to do that. It's not that those things are bad, but if we're doing those exclusively, it's problematic. Any other thoughts or perspectives on what we talked about this morning? Oh, yeah, Lainey.
I was just going to say, every time I hear something like that, the huddle versus the game, the inward versus the outward, one thing that I think in every ministry setting I've been in that has been a struggle is the scarcity versus abundance mindsets. And I feel like the scarcity mindset is what gets us to want to stay in the huddle or only focus inward, and the abundance helps us focus outward. And so just constantly thinking about what are some ways to help myself and help the others in the congregation get to that abundance mindset instead of being stuck in the scarcity. So, which makes it kind of hard to get out of the huddle sometimes.
Yes, yeah. I was actually talking with somebody else after between my presentation and lunch, who said that he had been part of another church in the Synod that I know, and that church has a really big building, and they do not need a really big building anymore. And it's beautiful. It's beautiful, and it's well kept and everything. And he was telling me, he's now in this presbytery, right? But he was in another Presbyterian church, and he was saying how they would try to open the building. There was like a children's theater or something, but then people started complaining that the kids did too much damage to the church, so they closed the children. And then there was something else that was, but it cost too much money to keep the electricity on for them to use the building, and it's just kind of the scarcity mindset, rather than thinking, well, the purpose of the building it's not a clubhouse for the members. It's very easy to think about it as a clubhouse for the members, but it's not. It's an asset for the community, and if it's an asset for the community, then it's worth the electricity, right?
That's when you go back to the huddle, right?
Right, yeah. Kathy said that's when you go back to the huddle, right? Yeah.
One thing our church did recently in Circleville, we had an incident with a police officer and an African-American person, and our church decided to go down there. There was going to be a possibility of fairly large protests, which didn't really materialize. There were a handful of people there, but I remember we took bottles of water down there, cold water for people, because it was a warm day. And I remember seeing a gentleman across the street from us who was obviously a racist person, and it called into question my faith. I thought, do I offer this man a bottle of water or do I not? And I decided to take a bottle over to him because I thought, maybe if my act of kindness plants a seed in this person's heart, he might find an opening there. So it was just a great way to serve the community.
Yeah. Hi, Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa. One of the questions that I've often found myself asking is trying to check myself. Are we doing this because we think it's going to bring people into the church, or are we simply doing it as an expression of responding to what God has done for us?
Yeah, that's so great, Lisa. If I had had more time this morning, I was going to talk about that. Did you notice in Paula's video that there was nothing in that video about how, well, we need to bring all these people into our church? There was nothing, like all of those different things that they were doing, none of it was like, well, we want to make sure that all of those middle school cross-country runners come to church. Or we want to make sure those road workers have a place to worship on Sunday morning. Like they do those things because it's faithful to the gospel and because it helps people experience the abundant life that God wants for them. Now, if any of them had wanted to come to church, I'm sure they would have welcomed them with open arms. But as Lisa said, they weren't doing those in a kind of a sense of we have to do this in order to, we're not doing this in order to have more people come to church. And the first time I heard that, it was like mind-blowing to me because we're so oriented around wanting our churches to grow and thrive. And I remember it was a workshop at that church in Central Illinois that I worked. We had all these people in, and the presenters were talking about this stuff, and I was just sitting there going, no, they need to come to church. They need to come to church. And I have really had a big change. I've had, that's probably been 15 years ago, and I've had a chance to really grow into this different perspective. I also want our churches to grow and thrive. It's not that I don't want our churches to grow and thrive, but the reason that we work to show God's love to our communities is not simply so that because then that's back to the huddle, right? Like if the thing is just, and newsflash, nobody wants to join a church to help your church survive. Right? I was talking to Gail, you've been 3 years at your church now, right? Yeah, I don't think you were like, oh boy, I can't wait to find a church that by my going there can help it thrive. You just wanted a church that was a good match for you. You didn't want to be an instrument of their survival. So, let's take one more question, then I want to turn it over to Nancy to tell you a story about the church where she served in Chicagoland. Katie, go ahead.
So building off of these last couple of comments, I think one of the dangers, the traps we can fall into is make it an either or. Mm-hmm. So we start to say, so you're bad if you're trying to build up your church. And right. Of course, that's not what we're saying.
Right, of course not.
That one feeds the other, and that when you're healthy together, you can be more loving out in the community. Yeah. So sometimes we can try a start is to try an activity that will do both.
Right.
We had a garage sale that ended up, they can go other ways, but ended up with people having a really good time together that raised money to go to a local school to support families there.
Right.
So to make it of a piece
exactly.
instead of opposition.
Yeah. Thank you. So I want to introduce to you Nancy Detterer, who's the pastor in Circleville. I don't know if you have met it. Nancy, you've been here 2 years? Year and a half? How long? Year and a half. And Nancy was a senior at Alma College when I was a freshman at Alma College. So she taught me everything that I know. And she had what I think is a very inspiring journey with her church in Homewood, Illinois, about helping them to turn outward. And so I invited her to come and give you kind of an extended, I was like, well, I could tell her story, but it's much better if she tells her story. So I'm going to let her do that.
Thank you, Chip. Okay, I'm going to try it in, can you hear me okay? Sounds like it.
But I don't know if it will be okay for the recording if you don't do it into the mic.
So I should hold it? Should I? It's hard with how the legs are is the problem. Anyway, if I'd had it all memorized, the reason I'm using a stand is because I want to watch my time, because there's so much to share. Yes, that works. So I served a church in Illinois near Chicago, a typical Presbyterian church that had wonderful, God-loving people in it and did lots of good things. And they had had a beloved pastor there for 30 plus years, and when he retired, the identity of the church retired with him. And so that church really struggled to find out and figure out who they were. And one of the refrains I kept hearing and why they weren't growing, and one of the biggest refrains was, we're the first church in our community, established in our community, and people should just know that we're here and they should be here too. In the spring of 2013, I started in 2001. In 2013, we got to a point where we were invited to participate in New Beginnings, which was an initiative through the denomination and to the presbyteries. I don't know if Scioto Valley had it here, but it was about revitalization, basically. And it was taking a deeper look at ourselves, what our passion was as a church, what we were good at, because sometimes our passion doesn't mean we're good at it, what our resources are, and what is relevant. And so about 50 of our church members, officers and lay people, church at-large members, gathered and committed to this 2-month program during the Easter season. Good time, we're already talking about resurrection, great season to do this. The first time we met, and the consultant was there and was just kind of introducing us, and he asked that very question that you mentioned this morning. If your church closed today, what would the community miss? Dead silence. And then finally somebody said, well, they'd miss hearing the carillon play at noon. And somebody else said, oh, they'd miss our float in the 4th of July parade. And then somebody finally said, AA would miss us a lot because we hosted meetings every day. It took them a long period of silence to get to that. So we went boldly went where we hadn't dared to go before, and really committed to openness and honesty with each other through this New Beginnings journey. And we discerned, surprise, surprise, that our passion and what we really did well was worship and music. The kicker was that what's relevant to the community question? It was problematic because we realized that what we valued and did so well wasn't really relevant to anybody but those of us who were already inside in the pews. And it was heartrending to say this out loud. It was painful for me as a pastor, well-trained in worship and music, and it was agonizing for this congregation of the oldest church in town to realize that they were completely out of touch. Once we confessed this, and I mean confession as in prayer of confession and worship and hearing God's word of reassurance that we weren't lost, we weren't forgotten, we weren't going to be, excommunicated from God's community. When we heard the good word of resurrection and hope, we then began asking the question, okay, how can we change? What can we do? Where do we go from here? The session concluded that we didn't know our neighbors anymore. The community had been changing rapidly just under their noses, but they hadn't taken any notice, or maybe they hadn't taken any interest. But if we don't know who they are, how will we know where our strengths and resources might intersect with the community's need? Every session meeting for the next 9 months, we prayed and asked, how shall we get to know our community better? And every single elder around the table would say, yes, that is important, but don't ask me to talk to somebody I don't know. I am not exaggerating. 9 months, every meeting, every elder. So the conversation stalled. And there was concern about, we've just done one more of those programs that's going to amount to nothing. Same old, same old. But I had to start wondering if it was stalling or maybe it was God's plan incubating. In the 10th month, right before our session meeting, I put together a proposal to session for fun of considering ways to get to know our neighbors. And there were 11 conversation-starting ideas on the sheet of paper. Some were big, like rent a storefront downtown and open up a little cafe kind of thing. Or redesign the front church lawn and add all-weather tables and chairs so we could be an outdoor gathering place for the neighbors. Or hire a seminary intern to do this for us. Some were small ideas. Partner with the food pantry. Now that's not really small, but less financially, big component items like that. Another was offer summer cookouts weekly. And I had one that was host an Eat Free at Eat Rice. And Eat Rice was a local Chinese restaurant where the teenagers hung out all the time because it was cheap and they welcomed the kids there. Now, I felt really energized working on this sheet of paper. And I was excited about visioning what each of those scenarios might play out. So I took the list to session, hoping to stimulate some kind of conversation. We went around the table, they each had the sheet in their hands, and it just happened that there were 11 elders there, so each one read one out loud. And every single thing, whether it was a big ticket item or a small ticket item, was shot down by the person who read it. Why would we do that? How is that going to help anything? Doesn't some other group do those things? And I went home shaking my head because I couldn't even get a conversation started about getting to know our neighbors. Well, I put an extra copy in the 12th elder's box who hadn't been able to attend that meeting. Didn't say anything about it, just threw it in the box. And he called me the next week wondering what this thing was. And I told him what had happened at session that night. And so then he asked, well, is there an idea on the list, Nancy, that you think is even doable? And I mentioned the hosting of the summer weekly cookouts. After all, second on our list of passion and resources and what we do well was fellowship meals. Most Presbyterians can probably say that too, right? It wasn't a unique thing, but it was something that we talked about. So at the next session meeting in April, Dan brought up the concept of weekly cookouts. An elder said, well, we could probably do that once a month. And I responded, and well, I probably talked too much in session, but I don't talk back in session, But I said, you're right, we could do this once a month, blindfolded and with both hands tied behind our back. Our step needs to be bold and radical for us, and it needs to be a bit of a stretch for us. 4 elders then volunteered to become a team to guide the church into 12 free summer weekly cookouts with the express purpose of getting to know our neighbors. At the first little task force meeting, someone asked, do they have to be cookouts? We don't even have a grill at the church. So was that it would smell, the smell of hamburgers and hot dogs would filter out down the street of our neighborhood. And we were a church. There were houses on each side of us and across. We were like one parallel street to the main street. So the idea was to have, that something that would pique people's curiosity and maybe make them come by. So another elder said, well, I'll buy a grill. And I added, and the church will pay for it. Because in January, before all of this, but after we'd done the study of New Beginnings, we were anticipating that we'd be doing something different, but we didn't know what. So Session designated a line item of missional ventures. And missional was a pretty new word at that time, getting out of ourselves, right? We designated $4,000 to missional ventures to be used for whatever would move us on and outside toward relevant ministry. So we kept the meals simple, just the meat and buns and potato chips and brownies and lemonade and water. And absolutely no free will offering basket. That was a hard one to convince them of too. We always have one of those. On that first Monday in June, 30 people showed up, 9 of whom had no previous connection with the church, even though they lived 3 or 4 houses down from us. One of our elderly pillars of the church came with his wife to check things out. He was a bit of a skeptic, and she brought a great big pot of her famous baked beans. The gift of their presence, whether they realized it or not, put a stamp of approval on it so that the venture then was accepted and supported by other member skeptics that were in the church, and they invested themselves as well. As the summer progressed, the dinners grew and drew more people in. One week we had a dozen kids that showed up after playing ultimate frisbee at the park at the end of our street. They ate, and then they played an awesome game of chutes and ladders. Several weeks later, 25 teenagers showed up and we sat among them. One night, a couple from a nearby senior citizen living center came with their grandchildren, and the husband asked if we would like him to bring a saxophone sometime. Sure, we said. And he brought it every week after that and serenaded us while we ate together with saxophone music. My favorite was a neighbor who lived a couple doors down across the street, and he said, I saw your sign for free supper, and I had to come see if this was for real. And then he asked if he could take it to go because, he said, I have beer at home. While we were there, we learned the names of the regulars that came back. And we learned a little bit of their stories. And most of them suddenly started feeling ownership of this meal. They'd come early to help set up because we were an older congregation and we were hauling out those big metal chairs and long tables and card tables every single week from the basement up a flight of stairs to the parking lot. And so these young folk decided that they'd like to help. We didn't ask them. We told them, oh, no, you don't have to help. There was a retired man who lived down the street who was, you'd always see around about town picking up litter. And he came to our supper and then went around with the trash can to each table and started clearing our plates as we finished. So our guests suddenly became co-hosts with us. Later on, there were guests who acted like, there were people who could not tell who was a member and who was a guest, because of the way the guests took ownership. Now, our purpose was to make connection with our neighbors and to learn about them, and it worked. Our shy Presbyterian members who said they'd never speak to anybody they didn't know surprised themselves. Turns out they're pretty good talking to just about anybody and listening and hearing stories and sharing and finding things in common. After all, how do you get to know people but around the dinner table, right? That's what Jesus did. It's where strangers become friends. So we learned that people in our middle-class community were truly hungry. We had no idea that there was a hunger concern. And some people came out of physical hunger, and others were just starving for socialization, for fellowship. Now, there was no plan at all to continue past the end of August. We were doing those meals to learn what we needed, and then we would regroup. We would get into our huddle at session and discuss everything and then decide, well, what is it we want to do now? But on Labor Day weekend, the first Sunday of September, while I was preaching, there were a group of members texting each other in the pews saying, we've got to keep this going. We cannot stop doing this. And by the end of worship, as they're greeting me, they didn't say, hey, great sermon, Nancy. And I know it was a stellar one that Sunday. I'm sure it was. They said, I agreed to go do all the purchasing for September, and Laurel agreed that she would do the grilling and get things set up and get volunteers, and we're set. So the next Monday, we had our next dinner. And we did not have a session meeting to approve any of that. We just did it. It was. You know, there was that part of me, it's like, oh, I wonder if we should have, but 2 weeks later, the session had their regular meeting and agreed to move through the month to month. They would discuss this. Should we keep going? Should we stop? And let's move them indoors. It's getting cold here in Chicago. And then in November, they decided to continue for the year, to make it a whole year, to next June. Over the years, there was some organic things that happened. There was a sharing table that started by someone living in a senior center who the food was dropped off and people put the things they didn't want on a table, and she brought all that over and set it out. The prayers started. I was kind of the chaplain. They didn't let me in the kitchen. They didn't let me clean up much, but they said, just go talk to the people, Nancy. That's what we need you for. And so I listened to stories. And I'd pray with them if they asked. And that was my role, and it was wonderful. In our dinner conversations at the session level, finances never were discussed. That was never, ever, ever the question, and that was a huge transformation. It was always, well, what is this going to cost? That never entered the picture, and I don't think the session elders even realized that that happened. Nobody talked about money until they were ready to vote yes on the motion to continue. And then it was more like, it was like a footnote. And Missional Ventures will cover this. So to me, that was another sign of the Spirit at work. There are so many stories to tell, but you all have stories too. And I want to let that happen. But I want to emphasize the time it took, the struggle that we had, and those dinners started in 2014. I started there in 2001. It was a long, long time, but there became such amazing relationships and vitality that the congregation hadn't known in a long time. It gave us hands-on ways to put our faith to work, not for the community, but with the community. And then we grew as a true fellowship to feed the hungry, body and soul. Thank you for letting me share my story. Thanks, Chip.
Thank you for sharing. Whoops. Thank you for sharing your TED Talk. That was. No, it was great. Thank you so much. I remember you telling me, Nancy, that before the dinner started, when people would meet her in the community and she would say that she was at First Pres Homewood, people would say, "Oh, that's the church where your predecessor was." Like, that's the way that they identified the church, was by her predecessor. But then as the dinner started going, they would say, "Oh, that's the church with the dinners." And what a great thing to be known as in your town, the church with the dinners, where people come and play their saxophone and experience a little taste of the kingdom of heaven. So thank you so much for that. I want to tell you, I wish that I had a new friend of mine in Detroit who was here with me. She is Joan Han-Peter. She is, I think she's between 85 and 90, although you wouldn't know it from her. And she is a member of a large church in the Detroit area and lives at a retirement center. And when COVID started and they started putting everything out on, like, streaming everything, she realized that she could set up a church at her retirement center. And she and I have talked about it again and again and again about, why don't other churches do this? So what they do is they happen to stream it, but you could also show the weeks before. And people just come in together. If there's communion, they invite a pastor, then they turn down the sound, and then a pastor will do communion there. But they basically just come together and watch the worship service together and sing the hymns together, and they take part in it together. And of course, they are not, the people who are behind the scenes working on it are all Presbyterian. But of course, the people who come are not Presbyterian. That just people come from all over because they're so happy to have a church that they can go to every week. I have gone there a couple of times, and it really feels like church. They have done it up in a way that, because Joan Han-Peter is like this amazing woman, so they have the greeting committee, and they have the mission committee, and for the mission committee, for one of the things, the people at that satellite church gave more than the people at the big church. So they were very happy about that. I'm not sure what it was. It was like some donating thing, and they were all they told them, it's 40 days of Lent, you can give $40. You can give $1 a day for whatever it was. And they ended up giving more money from the satellite church than from the home church. But they have greeters. They don't pass the pads, but they have somebody checking people off as they come in, because of course it's a closed community, so people know each other. And it's really amazing to me how much it feels like going to church. And I think, Joan and I both think that they have made it into this complex thing that it does not need to be complex, but only because Joan wants to do complex things. But, probably all of your church, you probably have some kind of virtual worship, so you've got something that's either being recorded or being streamed or whatever, and you also probably have people from your church that are in retirement centers. Now, this is a retirement center. It's not I guess there's assisted living also, but it's not a nursing home. It's independent living. And it feels like that's something that your churches could do it's an example of another way to get out beyond your bounds. And they consider those people, they greet them from Sunday morning. They always say, those of you at Fox Run, we're so glad you're here, to help them feel a part of things. And it takes, it seems to me that takes a lot less work than doing a community dinner every week, right? That just finding the connection with the people. Their tech guy is like 85, so he's not exactly an expert on tech, but he's willing, and it goes okay. And it's just it's another example of a creative way to get outside the walls of the church towards people, to help them experience the gospel. And let me tell you one more story, then I'm going to put you in small groups for a second. There's a church in Plymouth Michigan, or not, excuse me, not Plymouth, Pontiac, Michigan. So another car maker, not Plymouth, but Pontiac. Pontiac is a pretty poor suburb of Detroit. It's where the Pontiac Silverdome used to be, where the Lions played, and they tore that down, and it's really a depressed area. And so First Pres Pontiac is there, and they think about like March 22nd, 2020. Anybody know what was going on around then? It was probably the first Sunday of COVID, right? Like maybe March 15th was the first Sunday that you didn't have church, but certainly by March 22nd, you weren't having church. And most churches, probably most of your churches, the churches that I'm familiar with, were desperate to think about, well, how can we make sure that we get our people to have worship in some way? You know, like that was really the activity. But First Pres Pontiac, their first thought was, we have all these people who work retail and work in the hospitality industry that are all going to lose their jobs. And so they started up a food pantry. Like before they started worship, they started up a food pantry. And they started where weekly they would offer, see who could come, and they would let them go shopping. Like it wasn't like, here's the thing. It was like, here's all this stuff. Come, just take what you want, or not take what you want, but take a reasonable amount of the things that you want that you think your family would enjoy. And it went on. And by the end of the first year, I don't have all the numbers right, but I think it was like about 50 families a week were being served. And then by when I got to know them, it was in 2000, and I think it was the end of 2021. By the end of 2021, there were like 140 families getting food there every week, and their whole church is like 60 families. So they were giving food. They were giving like 2.5 times as much food away as there were families from their church. And like Nancy didn't, because I gave her a time limit, she didn't tell you how businesses started contributing to this effort. The same thing with the food pantry. Other communities started, other people in the community started donating. So it wasn't just the church, but the church, like yours, had kind of catalyzed the community to care for the least of these in the community, which is really amazing. Chris?
High school students also got involved that needed community service hours at their high school. And so they started working in the kitchen, and it was just an amazing thing. And some of the people, the stories, we got to hear from different people. It was really, truly, to me, that was what church is and should be.
Thank you. So those are some examples. I want to put you in small groups. We have until 2. Is that right? Does anybody know? Until 2? Okay, it's 1:35. How about people on, well, you get to choose, okay? You get to choose. I've got 2 questions for you. If you get in a group of, let's say 3 or 4 people, just around you, sitting around you, however it's comfortable, and talk about either why is it hard to do this? Nancy's story had a lot of reasons why it's hard to do something like this, to get out of ourselves. So you could either talk about why it's hard to do this and maybe some strategies or ideas together to address those reasons why it's hard. Or you can talk about examples of what you've either seen or what you've done to share kind of inspiring things with each other. So I'm going to put you in these groups of 2 or 3. And if you run out of time talking about one, you can just switch to the other. So either why is it hard and what can you do to make it a little bit easier, or what are some ideas that you've seen or know about. And then we'll get back together at 10 till, so that'll give you 15 minutes to talk. Of course, introduce yourself, talk about where you're from a little bit, maybe tell each other the thing in the huddle your church does best. The thing in the huddle your church does best. So share that with each other, and then talk about either things that inspire you or ways that you have gotten out of your outside, or why is it hard to do it. So get in a group of 3 or 4 people, and we'll gather back together at 10 till. Oh, I was using... That was great.
I hope it was, I tried to really get it in that time frame. So I hope it
That was
was.
perfect. It was very inspiring. Very inspiring. It was good to hear it, the whole thing at once, because I was kind of
Yeah,
walking through.
yeah. And I haven't told that story for a while. I mean, it's there, and I have all these little vignettes, and so to go back and put it back together. Yeah. Thanks for asking.
You've got about 4 more minutes, about 4 more minutes. This is your 2-minute warning, your 2-minute warning. All right, let's come back together. Let's come back together. I'm glad to hear so much conversation, but let's come back together. And I'd love to hear from you about not something brilliant that you said, but something interesting enough that you heard from somebody else. Something that you heard from somebody else that you think is interesting enough for others to hear. So what did you hear from somebody else that would be interesting for others to hear? Do you know how insulting you are to the people in your group? That you did not hear anything in your group that it is worth repeating? You had all that conversation? Oh, here, we'll go. I'll come back to you next.
Our group said that our huddle thing that was the best of all was passing of the peace. They're really good at passing the peace.
Did you get to anything in your group about going outside your walls?
We did.
You did, all right. Keith?
One of the things that I scribbled down was making sure that we actually report to the congregation about what is happening, because a lot of times there are things that small groups in the church are doing and other people don't know it.
Right, yeah, and if they don't know it, they can't be inspired by it, right? So then they don't, so thank you, that's great. Somebody over here had Bob.
I think one thing in our group that became apparent is that COVID has tried to cause a sea change in what has happened, and that we're probably still in a recovery phase in some of that. But it really has had an impact that, you can think of positive and negative there.
Yeah, can, actually, whoops, oh, sorry for that. Yeah, what, just shout out, what about COVID has made it more difficult to reach out to others? What about life after COVID has made it more difficult?
People got used to staying home.
People got used to staying home, yep.
They watched the service on TV.
Yeah, they watch the service on TV instead of coming. What about things that might make it easier because of COVID?
That's a blessing, though, since COVID, is because a lot of our churches, we didn't have any technology to reach.
Right, yeah, so now there's technological, yeah, thank you. There's technological possibilities to be outside. Yeah, I think about my my nephew who, my sister, she regrets this herself, literally never took her kids to church, literally. And then he started dating a Christian who's now his wife, and she wanted him to go to church, and he said that he was more scared to go to church than he was to go in the houses in Baghdad that he had to go to as an army guy. And but now he would not have to go into a church without knowing what happens, right? So people like him can kind of get a sense for what's going to go on when they go inside there that it would never have known before. All right, what else did you hear? Who heard something in your group that's worth sharing with others?
Oh, you shared the taking the church out to a assisted living or retirement center. So the possibility was raised, well, how can we reach young people that way? Is there a
Oh, right, yeah, is there a way to
strategy if we really keep thinking outside the box?
Yeah, thank you. Right. Who else heard something?
So we heard from Priscilla at Second Pres and First Pres, sorry, in Newark, about how businesses in their area wanted to thrive, and how the community wanted to thrive, and how to partner and how to interact with the business community to make that happen. I mean, all of which would be outside the church.
Right.
How does a church help that happen?
Right, thank you. Priscilla getting a gold star again.
Well, we discussed why is it hard to get the young families that are in the church involved and help out and be part of the church ministries that we do a lot of outreach. And we wanted to I wanted to ask them, the members of my group, how do we get the young families that they show up on Christmas Eve and they show up on Easter, how can we get them to show up other times to help out in the church and outreach ministries?
Right. Yeah, and they might find it more, the studies show that kind of the younger you are, the more eager you are to be in the game than to be in the huddle. You know, like Paula said, right, about that young woman that would come up specifically to go on the third Sunday so she could be contributing to the world. But thank you, that's great. Let's see, what time is it? We've got 5 more minutes. I want to tell you one more story, but before I do, what else have you heard from members of your group that you think would be helpful for others to hear? I saw a good conversation in this group over here. Somebody's got to have heard something that was helpful for the group to hear.
Well, Ken mentioned that he found it interesting that on our we have a weekly Saturday evening meal for the neighborhood, and most of the people that come in are addicted or homeless or combination thereof. A lot of them haven't had a bath in a few weeks, so but we like to have the people that serve the meal come out and sit with these people. They don't want to, okay? They're afraid of the people that they're going to be sitting with. But what we found is the people that are brave enough to venture out and sit with these people, they find out that these people are just like me.
Yeah.
They have the same concerns, same problems. Yeah, they might be a little more down on their luck, but it means so much to these people just to be embraced by another person. So if you can venture outside and be kind to another person that doesn't have much, you'll make their day.
Yeah, the church where I served in Central Illinois, we had a monthly, we did not go weekly, we had a monthly lunch after church. We invited our mission partners to bring their clients. And we actually trained the people from the congregation. We gave them like lists of questions. And the questions were just like, where did you grow up? What, tell me about your family, like things that you might ask at a dinner party, but they were so worried about, oh my gosh, well, I'm talking to somebody that doesn't have anything in common with me. Well, guess what? We're humans. We have a lot of stuff in common that we can talk about. How about one more comment, and then actually I have two things to tell you. I've got one text to show you, to read you, and then another little story to tell you.
What I'm going to tell you is about a homeless shelter, not a church, but it has some parallels. Once the homeless daytime drop-in center got started by a small group of people, it grew. The volunteers showed up, the food showed up, the clothes showed up, the money showed up, just like the sidewalk lunch that she was talking about. People joined in and they wanted to help. And then speaking of talking to people, I spent time talking to a young man one day, and when we finished our conversation, he said to me, "Thank you for talking to me." And that has really resonated with me.
Yeah. Things that we take for granted, right? I got a text. Remember the church in Pontiac, not in Plymouth, but in Pontiac, that had the food pantry? I got a text, oddly enough, from the pastor there about whether she was a GA commissioner or not, which I said, I honestly don't remember. And I did say, funny, I was literally just talking about your church in a workshop I'm leading about getting outside of ourselves. She says, well, we are housing the cold weather shelter for Pontiac from Sunday until Monday morning over a week. It's the first time. So the crazy doesn't end, she said. And she said there were 9 guests last night. So Saturday worship tonight will be around the cots. And that's just so powerful and amazing, right? So the great thing is it's possible. We can do this. Our churches do this. And our churches can do this, and your churches can do this. So let's pray. I'm going to remind you of the prayer of that confirmation student, which was, Dear God, help our church to be more important to people outside the church than people inside the church. So let's just pray that together. Dear God, help our church to be more important to people outside of the church than to people inside it. Amen. Thank you so much for your attention and your good ideas for each other. I hope that it has sparked a spark that will keep glowing and growing. Thank you. I think we just get to stay here, and people will come in and join you.